Hey Axis and Allies players, the Goody Captain here. Welcome to my 10th and final video in my series on Axis and Allies Classic, and this video is titled, Is Axis and Allies Classic Balanced? This was not originally the intended topic of my last video. However, I felt like I had covered everything I wanted to say about Don's essays in my strategic videos and in video number 9. And this left pretty much an open space here at the end, which I think is neatly filled by this topic. This topic definitely should be addressed because on AxisandAllies.org a great many people believe that this game is in balance, and I wanted to take as much of an in-depth look at that claim as possible. Now, I have the board here set up. An active game is actually going right now. So this is really just a backdrop. I'm not going to be showing you anything just yet. This is more of an audio thing. Like I said earlier in my first video when I resumed myself, I played a lot of this game, and I was never quite convinced of the total catastrophe that it is to be the Axis, because if you read any of the forums online or talk to any grog nerds who've played this a lot back in the old days, they'll generally tell you the same thing, which is the Allies need a buy, or the Axis, excuse me, need a pretty significant buy to be able to stay in the game. I've heard as high as an 18 IPC buy for the Axis. So anyway, I don't want to claim a side yet. I want to do some more research in that argument. I mean to say, I don't want to take a side there yet. And I'm going to introduce some of the research that I've done here now, and then what I intend to do in the future to sort of try to solve this answer this question, excuse me, and use more of a numeral-based approach, more statistics. I want to start this topic by I'm not going to assert this, but I'm going to recommend that we think of Axis and Allies Classic in three sort of compartments in terms of big picture items moving towards victory as either side. And then we went over one of them extensively in video number 2. We went over the economy in depth there, and I sort of identified how the Allies have a very distinct economic advantage that affects the game, at least how the Axis should approach the game. But there's two other departments that I think should be considered as well: the tactical situation and the strategic situation. That's what I'm choosing to call them. And by tactical, what I really mean is the piece count, the at-start piece count of the total, not only the IPC value of each side's starting pieces, but the actual pieces themselves. How many infantry does Germany and Japan have totaled compared to the Allies totaled at the beginning of the game? So we'll be taking a quick snapshot look at that and deciding who might have the better advantage there. And then also the other compartment I like to think of Axis and Allies Classic as having is a strategic situation, and that is the board position. And we touched on some of that in my video series. So we'll take them in reverse order. In the strategic situation, like I said, I kind of covered some of the interesting parts of this about how Germany should be moving into Africa and Japan moving into Asia, so I don't want to repeat myself too much there. I would just like to add that the turn order is also fairly important, and the position of the actual pieces on the board. The turn order, especially if you're using the Russia restricted rule, is important because it lets Germany go before the British and the United States, allowing them basically free rein for options to attack first in the European theater, which is very important for Germany, and that basically the same is true of Japan. Now, Britain does get to go first, but rarely, if ever, does anything major against Japan. The most I think they can do is some kind of an attack into French Indochina, Burma, but that's very rarely have I seen that, and it's extremely risky. So that really does kind of go towards the Axis. It's better to be the Axis in the first round of combat in terms of what you're going to kill versus what you're going to lose. Generally speaking, the Axis can kill more Allied units at a smaller price. And then the last thing is the first thing that I mentioned here, which is the tactical situation and the actual pieces. Now I'm going to move the camera, okay? Because I've done some bean counting style math, which, if you know me by now, is stuff I kind of like to do. So we're going to go through what I've got on the board up here. This is the total count of all units in Axis and Allies Classic at start. So the total for J for Japan, G for Germany, they both start out with 19 infantry for a total of 38. Whereas Britain, Russia, and the United States have 10, 19, and 11 respectively for a total of 40 infantry at start. So you can see that the Allies they actually have a 2 infantry advantage. The Axis have a 3 tank advantage, 2 fighters advantage here, bombers they're equal, battleships they're equal, aircraft carriers they're equal, they're in a deficit of 2 transports, they're at par with submarines. If you and AnA aircraft guns I threw in here, the Allies have 1 more AA gun to deploy versus the at start forces allocated to the Japanese and the Germans. And over here I put a little asterisk next to this if you want to throw in the industrial complexes too. The Axis start out with 3 altogether, and while the Allies have 5. So this is actually, there's a lot of parity here. The Allies have a slight edge in infantry. The Axis have a slight edge in armor. A little bit more of a pronounced edge in fighters. In my argument, this is probably where they start out with the most pronounced advantage, but even then it's not that huge, as you can see. But yeah, it's not that amazing. This is the actual IPC value of the Allies at start forces, not including industrial complexes or AA guns, 448. Okay? If you do include the AA guns and industries, it's 548 in terms of their actual raw IPC value. And now the Axis, not including the anti-aircraft guns and industries, is 465 versus 530 if you include the AA guns and industries. So if you're including AA guns and industries, they actually start out with a deficit in terms of actual raw pieces on the board to go with their economic deficit. If you don't include AA guns and industries, yes, the Axis have 17. So not a huge IPC lead there. Although they do, again, their strategic situation allows them to kind of square that up by the end of the first round. This is one of the reasons why the first round is so important. You really want to inflict the maximum amount of casualties on the Allies as possible while receiving the least amount in return, while at the same time gaining as many IPCs as you can in the process. Okay, to start pushing you, and that's how you leverage your strategic advantage. So on the left column we have the Axis, and on the right column we have the Allies. So for the economic situation, that obviously goes to the Allies. The tactical situation in terms of the piece count, both sides don't really have any distinct advantage over the other. However, the strategic situation, the geographic positioning of these units and the turn order, I would say go towards the Axis. But these things don't scale equally. I have the economic in all caps because it is this is huge. This is much more important. It's much more important in my opinion. This is my opinion, but it's much more important to have the economic advantage than the strategic positional advantage at start when your tactical situation doesn't have much of an advantage. Or you don't have an edge in a tactical situation. So again, I say that this advantage for the Allies is stronger and better than this advantage for the Axis, given that there's no real edge for the Axis in the tactical situation. Okay, so again, I'm not taking any sides. I've just, I count things too much. I spend too much time bean counting, I think, and this is just the way my brain works. So I wanted to share that information with all you guys. And then I'm going to do I'm going to cover one more topic, and then issue a sort of challenge to myself and a request for help from the community before closing this video. And I'm going to introduce one. This is just more or less an analysis of the game. I'm not introducing this as evidence for either one side or the other having an advantage, but I will introduce this as in a way of segueing now into an argument for one side or the other. It does seem that Larry Harris himself seems to think that the Axis have a disadvantage, because as everybody knows who has this game, at the end, on the last page of the rule book, you have these optional rules, and there are basically 3 major rules that can be added into this game to help balance, quote unquote, the game in favor of the Axis. I want to talk about Russia restricted. The Russia restricted option is something that's very common, I've noticed, in playing this game with people online. It basically, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but as we all know, it restricts Russia from having a combat movement phase and a combat phase on the first turn. And I really like this rule. The reason I like it is because it shows a lot, it says a lot about Larry Harris, first off, in not just upping the strength of the Axis or down strengthening the Allies. No, he's finding more nuanced ways of balancing it. And I like this one because in the spring of 1942, when this game kicks off, the Russians really have just finished repulsing and pushing the Germans back from their capital, Moscow, right? And if you know your history well enough, you'll know that the Russians were pretty burned out after that counteroffensive. It wasn't all that successful. It was cost a lot of lives, and it had to do in part with Hitler's Stand Fast order. So Russia in the spring of '42 was not really in any position to launch any major offensives into the Ukraine. Okay, so that's one thing I just want to point out. So restricting Russia for the attack, I like it because it gives it a nice historical flavor, and it allows Germany to establish itself competitively, a little bit more competitively on that first turn, in terms of it being able to have basically at least its naval units still intact. Most Russian players will knock these out, and in the extreme they'll hit Ukraine SSR and even use their Russian submarine to attack the German sub west of Western Europe. Okay, so that one's cool. I like that one. It's historical, it makes sense, and it helps balance the game a little bit in the terms of if you thought the Axis needed a boost. I'm okay with that. So the next is weapons development. This is kind of weird. This one gives Germany jet power and Japanese super submarines. These are really kind of just odd. It's ahistorical. The Germans didn't have jets until late in the war, and the Japanese never had anything special. I mean, they had very large submarines, if you know your history real well, but they weren't overly spectacular. In fact, there's an argument that the Germans might be better off having super subs, not the Japanese. Definitely the more interesting of these two is the Germans having jets, because they will be doing a lot of defense if you're playing a competent Allied player. But I don't know if these, whatever 4 or 5 pieces that you have, if you're lucky you have all 5 by the time they matter in this situation. I don't know how much a 5 defense unit is going to really affect the game, okay? And even more so with the Japanese submarine that you start out with in the beginning of the game. This might make the Hawaiian Islands naval battle a little more enticing if you're on the fence about it, but otherwise it doesn't seem to do much. The thing that is interesting about this advantage, or this balance, it incentivizes slightly, or more than slightly, the Axis to go for industrial technology, and namely heavy bombers. Now instead of a 1 in 6 chance of getting heavy bombers, you have a 1 in 5. And not only that, you arguably have knocked off one of the more useless of the technologies, jets and subs not being looked very highly upon compared to the other 4 technologies on that list. Okay, so I'm not a huge fan of that one, but okay. The last one is no new industrial complexes, and in my playings, most people seem to not even know that this thing exists, because it never comes up when we're asking what kind of balance to use, or what balances we want to use. And I think most people agree that they would like the option, both Axis and Allies, of building more industries. But now that I'm theorizing here, because again, I've never played with this, but after playing many, many games of Classic, I feel that I know what Larry Harris had in mind here. If you remember my Allied, the Allied side of video number 2, you'll remember that for Britain's strategic video and in video number 2 when I was discussing the economy, I recommended building 2 industries on Britain's turn 1. They can do it, they have 30 IPCs, and since the goal of the Allies, I think, is containment, it's not the only way to win. Let me say that again, it's not the only way to win, but I believe it is the most efficient way to win as the Allies. When I'm the Axis player playing against the Allies and Britain does this, I am cringing. It is a lot harder to win. It's extremely difficult if the British do that successfully. So if they are not allowed to do that to begin with, if they're not allowed to do that at all, couple that with, if you play enough you'll realize this, starting out with a Japanese industry on turn 1, but building a Japanese industry on turn 1 is not really maximizing. I said there's an argument for it, but it's a rare situation. You don't really need Japan to have an industry on turn 1. You can have just as good effect by waiting until turn 2 or even 3. This affects, in my argument, this affects the Allies more than it affects the Axis at the beginning of the game. The British will be unable to do this containment strategy, and the Axis will be able to expand much easier and be able to have a chance at getting a good piece of the economic pie, so to speak, in time. Now, it will be annoying for the Axis, especially for the Japanese, in the mid to late game when Japan is, as this situation right now, has taken over much of Asia and would really like to build some industries. But again, you don't even get there if the British, or it's extremely difficult to create the situation if the British build 2 industries on their first turn. So this is one I'm highly interested in utilizing sometime. That's all I wanted to do, is discuss these balances and state for the record that it's clear that Larry Harris himself, the game designer, seems to agree that the Axis could use some help. And this leads me to my final comment here and my closing statement for and direction for this my next video. This 10-part series is over. However, I have not quit playing Axis and Allies Classic, as you can see, and I will continue to do so against anybody who challenges me, but I will be recording my games now. My intent is to, at least in terms of for my own conscience, I'd like to know, to convince myself, is this game balanced or not in favor of the Axis or the Allies, statistically as I can. And so I will record who I'm playing, what date the game was started, what the result, who played which side, and what the result was. I'll also be recording what balances were used. Did we use any of the 3 listed here? I'll also be recording the dice hit averages for either side. In other words, if one side or the other gets completely diced, I will be recording all the dice averages in mass. This means if you rolled, let's say, 51 attackers or 1 defenders throughout the game, and you got 25 hits, I will record that. It'll be recorded in my Excel spreadsheet, and that way we can take into account, or at least I can take into account, what how effective the dice might have, how much of a role the dice had in determining a winner or a loser. So I'm going to issue an open challenge. The only my conditions are that we use the second edition rules with any of the optional rules that we both agree upon in the back, and I will identify the rules that we're using in the spreadsheet. And I would prefer, although I don't require it, I would prefer that you consider yourself a 7 out of 10 or better in terms of playing Axis and Allies Classic. If you're brand new to the game, you know, we could probably set one up, but I wouldn't count on it being done right away, as I'm going to be focusing most of my time on trying to stack as many games as I can before I release my 11th video, which will be outside the series, but it will be a follow-up to this question of is Axis and Allies Classic balanced, where I'll be sharing my results, and ideally I'd like to get to at least 20 games before releasing that video, and if it takes 6 months, 8 months, or a year, then so be it. I'll see you then. I might release some other videos in the meantime, but if you are interested in playing a game with me, look for my handle on axisandallies.org. It's aceswild5049. Send me a message. Comment in the description below. We'll get in touch. And yeah, because I really like to keep playing and figure out how to make this game better if it is imbalanced, and that would be the next topic I tackle. So sorry for all this being so verbose, but I did want to tie up these, what I consider these last few loose ends. If you've watched all my other videos, thank you so very much for watching this. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.